The sun had barely risen over Buttercup Hills when a colossal figure emerged from the forest's edge. His name was Burlap, a giant by every definition, a towering specimen of muscle and girth who made tree trunks look like twigs. But for all his tremendous height and broad shoulders, Burlap had a soft, timid nature. Without fail, his kindness was overshadowed by his unfortunate ability to break every single piece of furniture he dared to use. Chairs splintered under him. Sofas gave out with a groan. It was the perpetual problem of being quite literally too big to hide. This morning, Burlap had a single quest in mind: find a bed and breakfastus where he could discreetly spend the night. He had grown tired of napping in the forest, where the floor was damp and the wind gave him allergies, and he desperately wanted a warm meal that didn't involve scrounging for half-burnt chestnuts. So he had ventured toward a quaint settlement known for its cozy accommodations. Of course, the challenge was obvious. How could a 10-foot tall, 4-foot wide, lumbering giant possibly sneak into a shop that was maybe 8 feet tall at the roof's highest point? As he clomped into the outskirts of Willowick Village, he dared not set foot directly onto the well-tended cobblestone roads. The residents were still sleeping, and the last thing he wanted was to be spotted, especially if they'd begun suspecting an invasion. Instead, he carefully tiptoed atop grassy patches near the houses. Each massive step made the ground shudder. He clenched his teeth, shooting worried glances at the sleeping windows. As far as he could tell, no one was up yet. Well, except for 1 or 2 roosters that crowed in the distance, and the occasional dog that barked at unusual vibrations. Soon he found the perfect bed and breakfast. It was called the Coddled Duckling. An impossibly quaint cottage with flower boxes under the windows, a bright yellow door, and a painted sign that featured a happily smirking duck. It looked like something he might have admired from a distance in storybooks. The building exuded comfort. Burlap sighed. This was exactly what he needed, if only the interior were large enough for him to stand upright without smashing the ceiling. He tiptoed to the side of the cottage, carefully brushing past the fence. Splinter. The fence squeaked in protest, and he froze in alarm. If it broke, that would be the end of his stealth mission. But thankfully, the fence withstood the brief pressure of his knee. As he squatted, the better to stay hidden, he studied the few lights already shining through the windows. It appeared the BnB owners were starting breakfast prep. He rubbed his big hands together in nervous glee. He murmured to himself, ducking as low as possible. I can't barge in the front door. Maybe I can find a back entrance. Let's see. Maybe there's a stable or a barn? A glance told him there was, indeed, a small shed in the back, though it didn't look big enough for a giant chicken, let alone a giant man. He snuck around, hugging the walls of the neighboring buildings so no passersby in the distant street would see him. Even in the early sun, shadows cast by the taller shops provided half-decent cover. Burlap had often tried to rely on shadows in his travels, but nothing could obscure the fact that he was built like a fortress. If he stayed perfectly still and hunched, sometimes people might think he was a massive statue of questionable taste. But the slightest twitch gave him away. Once he reached the rear of the coddled duckling, he examined the back door. Like the rest of the cottage, it was delightfully small, clearly meant for normal-sized residents. Burlap scratched his beard, uncertain. He figured he could squeeze in if he lay on his side and wriggled like a worm. But that was hardly a subtle way to make an entrance. He carefully put one ear to the door, listening for activity. Pots clanged, a cheerful voice hummed. He smelled bacon and eggs sizzling, and felt his stomach rumble so hard it nearly knocked him off balance. A good hearty meal was so close. He realized, however, that one of 2 things must happen. Either he revealed himself to the owners and accepted likely rejection, or he attempted some kind of stealthy infiltration. But how could he pay for a night's stay if the owners never even saw him? Some illusions were best abandoned, but Burlap wasn't quite ready to give up the dream of a cozy bed. He paced in the yard for several moments, nearly stamping down an entire row of daisies in the process, until he came up with a plan worthy of at least partial comedic chaos. He licked his lips, cleared his throat, and gently rapped on the door. While he tried to do it gently, the hinges rattled, a few cups inside tumbled off a shelf with a crash, and a pan boomed as it hit the floor. A muffled squeal and frantic footsteps came from within. Then, after a beat, the door was flung open by a short, stout woman with bright red curls. Her eyes grew as large as saucers when she saw him looming above. God, giant, she stammered. Merciful heavens, you scared me half to death. Burlap instinctively hunched lower, but that only made him look like an out-of-place boulder. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean to startle you. The woman, who wore an apron emblazoned with the same smirking duck from the sign, made a noise between a gasp and a squeak. Young man, big man, why are you here? He forced a gentle tone. I'm traveling. I need a place to stay. You wouldn't happen to have a giant-sized room available, would you? She blinked. We have a cozy attic and a grandeur suite, but neither is giant-size per se. Her gaze dropped to his enormous feet. Mercy me, it wouldn't do at all. You'd put your head through our roof if you stood upright in the second-floor suite. He nodded in resignation. I understand. I just wish, well, is there any chance I might be allowed to stay the night anyway? I'm tired of the forest. I'll pay double, triple even. He held out a sack of coins, which looked comedic in his gigantic palms like a small purse in a normal man's hands. The woman looked torn. My husband, Reginald, will have a say in this. Our guests might be frightened if they see you. Giants don't exactly visit often. Let me speak with him, Burlap ventured. Then he realized that might lead to them calling the village watch. But it was too late now. He'd begun the conversation. Wait right here, the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. Don't move too much. I'm Hilda, by the way. Try not to break anything. She offered a trembling smile and hurried inside, leaving the door ajar. Burlap did his best to remain as still as possible. He closed his eyes and tried to practice the calming nature spells he'd read about in a druid's old scroll once. His mind, though, kept wandering to the aromatic smell of the sizzling breakfast. His stomach gurgled ominously. Footsteps approached inside, louder this time. Well, normal loud for normal people, but quite feeble for a giant. Hilda reappeared, followed by her husband Reginald, a wiry man with glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Reginald had an air of quiet cunning, like he was sizing up every inch of Burlap's substantial figure. Giant, you say? Reginald scratched his chin. Well, you're the largest man I've ever seen. Probably weigh a ton, I'd wager. Despite the formal inquisitiveness, he stepped around Burlap's sides as if checking for potential damage. Are you a threat, by chance? Burlap shook his head so vigorously that Reginald had to steady himself. No, sir. I've never hurt anyone, nor do I intend to. I'm just big. People assume I'm dangerous. I'm as gentle as a kitten, though hopefully less hairy. Hilda giggled in spite of herself. Reginald frowned but nodded. All right. We don't have any giant accommodations, but if you're so determined to stay here, perhaps we can work something out. We'll just have to be creative. He looked at his wife. Hilda, show him to the side entrance. That might have more clearance than the back door. But please, dear, for the love of all that's breakable, let him remove his shoes first. Those boots look like they could flatten our entire store cupboard. A rush of relief swept over Burlap. Thank you. I promise I'll be careful, and I can pay whatever you ask. Hilda and Reginald exchanged significant glances. Some silent, married couple conversation seemed to pass between them. An unspoken agreement that they were about to become the talk of the village for weeks to come. But the coins in Burlap's sack, and possibly some compassion, must have outweighed that concern. Hilda beckoned Burlap around the cottage. He did his best to keep close to the walls, but still knocked a dangling wind chime to the ground. It clattered, sending a litter of adorable duck-shaped trinkets spinning across the grass. Sorry, he hissed, stooping to gather them up. He was more of a hazard than a burglar. Eventually, they reached a side entrance that led into the BnB's modest dining area. Burlap was told to remove his boots, an act that unleashed a smell so potent that Hilda nearly fainted. He apologized profusely, making a mental note to find a giant-sized foot wash later. Then, with much grunting and squirming, he attempted to wedge himself through the doorway. First, he tried going in feet first. He made it up to the hips before his shoulders jammed. Next, he tried going sideways. His arms got stuck and he had to wiggle back out. A moment later, he tried crawling, which fared only slightly better, until his bottom scraped the top of the doorframe. Hilda and Reginald watched in horror, as if witnessing a donkey trying to leap through a doggy door. Their eyes bulged, half out of fear for their beloved cottage, and half from a comedic sense of disbelief. Meanwhile, Burlap's thunderous grunts accompanied each attempt. At last, with a mighty grunt, he managed to fit his torso through, albeit at a precarious angle. His face was nearly pressed against the floor, arms outstretched in front, legs still flailing outside. He was scuffing the wood paneling and realized with alarm that the friction might ignite a spark if he moved too fast. That was the last thing he wanted, to set the coddled duckling ablaze. Just a bit more, Hilda coaxed, trying to guide his left foot indoors. Reginald was literally pushing on his right foot, as if that would offer the final nudge. Somehow, with a resounding pop, Burlap tumbled forward into the dining area. Reginald and Hilda scrambled out of the way, narrowly missing being pinned by a giant's butt. Burlap landed on his belly, flattening 3 chairs and a small side table. The unfortunate furniture made a shriek of protest and collapsed in a heap of splinters and appended place settings. The crash was so loud that moments later, guests staying in the B&B burst into the hallway to see if an earthquake had struck. Burlap was sprawled across the floor, awkwardly propped on his elbows, face red with embarrassment. Hilda's mouth formed a silent "oh dear," and Reginald looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of that one tumble. The guests, an older couple in matching robes, plus a traveling salesman with a battered suitcase, peered into the dining area. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the old man's eyebrows soared into his gray hairline, and the older woman's jaw dropped. The traveling salesman swallowed audibly. Finally, the older lady asked in an odd tone, "Is that a giant in our dining room?" Reginald cleared his throat in an attempt to regain some normalcy. "Yes, a temporary guest. Please don't worry, my dear patrons. We will, of course, discount your stay if this has inconvenienced you." He shot a look at Burlap, who tried to fold himself into a less monstrous shape, but contortion was not his forte. In a surprising turn, the older man grinned. "I've never seen a giant in person. Fascinating." His wife elbowed him suspiciously. "Mind your manners, Tom. This giant is clearly in some distress." Then she turned a soft gaze on Burlap. "Are you all right, dear? That fall looked painful." Burlap managed a bashful nod. "Yes, ma'am, I'm tough as a rock. The chairs, though." A sheepish glance at the broken furniture made it clear who had fared worse. As it turned out, the traveling salesman was more annoyed than frightened. "Am I to assume breakfast will be delayed?" Hilda, who prided herself on excellent service, brushed the dust off her apron. "Delay be darned. We'll have breakfast out soon. If you don't mind, perhaps you can all sit on the side porch for your meal this morning, since our chairs inside, well, we have fewer at the moment." She tried to keep her tone cheerful, though it wavered. The guests shrugged, intrigued by the spectacle, and retreated to the porch. Meanwhile, Burlap attempted to stand. He rose to his hands and knees, only to realize his head was inches from the low ceiling. Carefully, he kept his neck bent so he wouldn't punch a hole in the white plaster. Even stooped, he dwarfed the room. He turned this way and that, searching for a corner where he could rest without snapping everything in half. Reginald removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "There's no chance of you navigating the stairs, not unless you want to break them. Our second floor can't hold you. Maybe you can sleep in the parlor if we move the furniture out." "That would be lovely," Burlap offered, trying to look grateful despite the humiliation. With a resigned sigh, Reginald left to retrieve some tools. Hilda, heartbreak in her eyes, surveyed the splintered remnants of her beloved chairs. "They belong to my grandmother," she whispered, mostly to herself. Burlap felt a knot in his chest. "I'm so sorry," he said, voice trembling with genuine remorse. "I'll pay for replacements, new ones, or antiques if I can find them. Please don't think I'm careless. I'm just extra large." She patted one of his arms, which was about as thick as her waist. "I know you're not careless, dear. Accidents happen, more so I imagine, when you're bigger than a stable." She offered a small, forgiving smile. "Let's get you settled. Once Reginald moves the sofa and chairs from the parlor, you can sprawl out there." In short order, Hilda left to bring breakfast to the porch guests, offering them the comedic tale of a giant lodging for the night. Burlap could hear excited whispers and scattered laughter from outside as the travelers discussed the bizarre turn of events. It occurred to him that maybe this wasn't so bad. He had expected fear or hostility, but so far he'd mostly encountered curiosity, mild alarm, and exasperation about the destroyed chairs. Overall, he'd take that as a win. Reginald returned with a crowbar and hammer, presumably to remove the parlor doors altogether. "We'll just create a big enough opening for you to fit," he explained, half to himself. "I think if I remove this entire door frame, you can sidestep into the parlor. But keep your head low, same as now." Seeing the mild destruction about to be inflicted on the cottage, Burlap felt another wave of guilt. "I'll pay for repairs," he promised. "I'll do chores too, if that helps. I'm quite strong. I can chop wood in half the time of a normal man." Reginald paused. "Well, that might be handy. We do burn a lot of firewood in the colder months, and the orchard near the village always needs help picking apples. Maybe they'd pay you as well." An idea seemed to sprout in his mind. "If you stayed a few days, you might earn enough to pay off the damage, provide a novelty for the guests, too. People like a story." "Are you sure you don't mind having me here for more than one night?" Burlap asked warily, suspecting the entire BnB staff might mutiny if they learned that a giant was staying indefinitely. Reginald shrugged. "If you can keep from smashing half the building, we might have ourselves a deal. We'll see how tonight goes first. One step at a time." They set to work removing the parlor door. In the process, Burlap held a supporting beam just to steady it, but almost cracked it in half by applying too much pressure. After some tense moments, the doorframe came loose. Reginald pulled it aside, leaving an open entry wide enough for Burlap to carefully turn sideways. With his breath held and his arms pinned tight to his sides, he managed to sidle into the parlor. There he found Hilda had already removed the sofa and chairs, pushing them to the hall to keep them from potential flattening. He lowered himself gingerly onto the parlor's rug, which was quite soft. Though he was still at an awkward angle, with his back against one wall and legs curled beneath him, he finally had a space where he could temporarily relax. The relief made him exhale so forcefully that curtains fluttered on the other side of the room. Hilda soon brought him a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. The ratio looked minuscule to him, like a child's pretend meal yet. He accepted it gratefully, torn between manners and hunger. The first bite was heaven. He closed his eyes, savoring the buttery eggs and crispy bacon. "This is the best meal I've had in ages," he said honestly. "I usually just dine on wild tubers and the occasional stolen pie from an abandoned windowsill." He immediately regretted admitting to the petty pie theft, but Hilda only laughed. "You can have more," she said, disappearing back into the kitchen. Indeed, she returned soon after with an entire skillet's worth of eggs and a plate piled high with bacon. That put more pep in Burlap's eyes. He devoured everything so quickly that Hilda's eyes went wide in awe. As a finishing touch, she handed him an entire loaf of bread, which he ate in massive bites that would have given a normal human a month's worth of carbs in 5 minutes. The hours passed with surprising normalcy, or as normal as things can be when a giant is curled up in your parlor. The guests finished their breakfasts, and a few even peeked in to say hello to Burlap. He offered polite waves and asked them about their travels. The traveling salesman grudgingly admitted that, despite his initial annoyance, having a giant around was pretty amusing. The older couple seemed charmed by the novelty, and the woman gave Burlap a homemade cookie she'd saved from last night. Though the cookie was only a crumb by his standards, he accepted it politely and pretended it was a grand feast. Late in the day, with the sun shining and the rest of the village awake, Hilda and Reginald decided it would be safer if Burlap stayed inside rather than risk scaring the townsfolk. However, there came a knock at the front door. Several knocks, actually. Voices murmured outside. Hilda reached for the door and carefully opened it, just a crack. In the doorway stood a pair of local watchers, the tall, broad-shouldered type that typically deterred rowdy visitors. One of them peered over Hilda's shoulder and frowned at the suspicious removal of the doorframe leading to the parlor. "There have been reports of loud crashes," the first watchman explained. "A quake or something like it, possibly a monstrous intruder." Hilda tried to remain calm. "We had a little mishap, but everything is under control." The second watchman craned his neck. gaze falling on the massive shadow within the parlor. Burlap tried to scoot out of sight, but that only made the entire wall groan. The watchman's eyes went wide. "Is that a giant?" Reginald stepped forward, applying his best diplomatic voice. "A peaceful giant, yes. He means no harm. He's simply exploring lodging opportunities. We've handled the situation. No danger to the village, I assure you." The watchmen exchanged dubious looks, but their posture relaxed a bit. "No one's in danger?" "Not unless you count broken chairs and a door frame," Reginald admitted. "He's a bit clumsy, but we're fine." The watchman mulled it over. Finally, one shrugged. "Well, if you're sure, we'll just make a note in the log. But if he starts causing trouble, stealing livestock, or toppling windmills, you let us know, all right?" "Absolutely," Hilda said, ushering them out with a friendly wave. The watchers retreated, muttering about how bizarre their day was turning out. Inside, Burlap exchanged relieved glances with the couple. "Thank you," he said sincerely. As night fell, the B&B's guests retired to their respective rooms. Burlap found himself drooping with exhaustion. It had been quite a day. He had arrived hoping to remain undetected, but that plan had failed spectacularly. Still, to his astonishment, it seemed that the fiasco might actually work out. He wasn't being chased away by a mob, nor was he forced to sleep under a dripping tree. He was inside a warm house with food in his belly. He did his best to get comfortable on the parlor floor. Hilda and Reginald fetched him as many blankets as they could find, piling them high so he at least had a makeshift pillow. Burlap's chin rested on the crocheted quilt, which smelled of lavender and home. He almost shed a tear of gratitude. "Good night," Hilda whispered. She was standing in the parlor doorway, candle in hand. "We'll see you in the morning. Let us know if you need anything." Burlap shifted carefully, cradling his head against the folded blanket. "Thank you again, both of you. I've never been welcomed like this before." Reginald managed a half smile. He still seemed a little overwhelmed, but there was kindness in his eyes. "Sleep well, just don't roll over too suddenly." They left him to the darkness. He listened to the hush of the night, the slight creaking of the cottage, the scuttle of a mouse under the floorboards, and the faint drip of water from the kitchen sink. Each noise sounded bright and small in this normally human-scaled environment. Burlap was used to the loud rustling of forest creatures, the crashing of distant waterfalls, and the groaning of ancient pines. But now, everything here felt cozy, personal. As he drifted off, his last thought was that maybe he could belong somewhere, giant or not. Morning arrived with a mixture of excitement and mild dread. Burlap carefully woke, trying not to rupture the plaster with a morning stretch. The B&B's routine began again, with Hilda in the kitchen, Reginald greeting the guests as they trickled in for breakfast. Burlap's presence was no longer a secret. The traveling salesman took a few snapshots with a small camera contraption, stammering something about marketing. The older couple offered him leftover scones. At one point, a few curious townies appeared at the entrance, wide-eyed, presumably told the giant rumor by the watchman. Reginald tried to limit gawking by reminding them that the coddled duckling was still a business and not a zoo. Unbeknownst to most, Burlap felt a strange pride in being a bit of a celebrity. He helped out by gently carrying a new load of firewood to the shed. After all, he could lift entire tree trunks. He also took some time to carefully reattach the wind chime he had knocked down the previous day, though it hung about 2 feet too high now. Hilda couldn't reach it to give it a tune-up without a ladder, but at least it was in one piece again. Later, with the day's chores winding down, Burlap found himself in the backyard with a small crowd of children who had come from the nearby houses to see the friendly giant. At first, they stood a healthy distance away, eyes shimmering with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. But once Burlap smiled his big, dimply grin that could brighten a rainy sky, they giggled and barreled right up to him, chanting that they wanted to ride on his shoulders. He politely declined that request since letting a dozen children climb on him threatened to become a small carnival safety hazard. Instead, he showed them how he could reach the top branches of an apple tree to pick fresh fruit. This display earned elated cheers. Adults quietly watched from behind fences, uncertain whether to trust the towering figure who laughed with their children. But it was hard to be fearful of a giant who apologized profusely whenever he accidentally stepped on a stray frog or brushed against a hanging flower basket. At dinner, the guests insisted on hearing Burlap's story, how he had grown up in the enormous northern mountains, raised by giant caregivers who taught him the ways of their people, but how he'd ventured out to see the smaller world. Some had friendly questions. What's your shoe size anyway? While others wanted to know about giant tribes. Burlap politely answered where he could, though he was careful not to reveal anything that might cause trouble for his giant relatives. Despite his caution, he enjoyed the attention. He had rarely gotten such a warm reception from the little folk, human beings, dwarves, halflings. Usually they chased him off with pitchforks. Here he was a guest. When night fell again, Burlap realized that it had been nearly 2 full days since his arrival. He sat in the parlor, leaning against the wall while reading a newspaper that Hilda had fetched for him. The text was cramped and small, but he enjoyed the novelty of reading about daily village life, missing pets, baked goods contests, and the upcoming harvest festival. Reginald approached, clearing his throat. "You are our lap about your stay. We've had many inquirers from travelers asking if the rumor is true, if there's a giant boarder at the Coddled Duckling. Some folks even want to drop by and see you. Well, Hilda and I have discussed it, and if you're up for it, we'd be happy to host you longer." Burlap nearly dropped the newspaper. "You mean you want me to stay? Even though I broke your chairs, you removed a doorframe, and your guests had to sit on the porch for breakfast?" Reginald smiled with a shrug. "We can buy new chairs. The damage can be fixed, and the guests love telling their friends they shared a B&B with a giant. Turns out, having you around isn't such a bad business move." Hilda stepped up beside her husband, nodding in agreement. "We can make bigger doorways in the parlor, maybe add a giant friendly addition to the back. We'll figure out the logistics. In return, you can help out, chop wood or gather orchard produce, maybe even do some chores that our older neighbors struggle with. And of course, you'll pay what you can." Burlap's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "I'd love that, yes. I'll be as careful as I can. I might even learn to tiptoe better." Hilda laughed, remembering the various near disasters. Yes, that would be much appreciated. It wasn't at all what he had imagined when he first approached Willowick Village, hoping to remain anonymous. He'd planned to sneak in, spend a quiet night, and sneak out. Instead, he'd become something of a local attraction, forging friendships and building a home away from home. A few days ago, he would never have believed that these villagers might accept him. Yet here he was, enveloped in their hospitality. By the third morning, Burlap already began planning ways to repay the Coddled Duckling. He surveyed the property, thinking of how to improve the fence he had nearly snapped, or maybe expand the shed. He considered leaving for a short trip to buy new chairs from the next town over, although finding giant appropriate chairs would be an odyssey in itself. Despite potential challenges, he felt invigorated. As he greeted the guests who ambled downstairs for breakfast, it was clear they were still delighted by the novelty of a giant. He even took a moment to help one elderly guest carry her luggage, which he lifted in a single hand. A few new arrivals stared in shock when Burlap stepped into the foyer, but their alarm melted into fascination after they realized he wasn't about to stomp on them. Later that day, he found himself standing behind the B&B, gazing at the hills. A gentle breeze caught the trees, rustling leaves and a soothing lullaby. He remembered the cold discomfort of sleeping in the woods, loneliness, mosquito bites the size of small birds, pine cones jabbing his spine. As comedic as the fiasco had been, as many chairs and doors he had destroyed, he realized with a warmth in his chest that it had all been worth it. Some misadventures are too big to hide, and sometimes that's okay. Because in the midst of the chaos, you might just find a place and a people who accept you for who you are, no matter your size. And that, Burlap decided, was a luxury far more precious than any quiet night he could have snuck through in secret.